We are recording this call, and that reminded me that I needed to turn on the record button, which I just did. So now let me turn it over to Barbara Ryan, who has been so kind to do this. It's been very time consuming for her, and I really appreciate it. And so she is a professional landscape designer. She can tell you all about herself. I hope she will. And take it from there, Barbara.
Sure. Thanks, Margaret. Hi, everybody, and thank you for being here. I'm really happy to be doing this, and it was a lot of fun actually to put this together and help me kind of organize a lot of photos and a lot of thoughts. So just a little bit about myself. I am a sustainable landscape designer. I have a master's degree from George Washington in sustainable landscape design. I'm also a CBLP, Chesapeake Bay certified landscape professional, level 1 and level 2 in both design and installation. And I'm a Virginia certified horticulturalist. And as Margaret knows, I'm also a certified Fairfax master naturalist. I kind of went on this journey in an evolutionary way. I also happen to be a PhD economist, and that was where I spent a lot of my career. And before I got, I've been a lifelong gardener before I got really heavily involved in this part of the natural world. And so it really is, it's a fun thing to be and to do, and I'm really looking forward to sharing with you what I have. So I'm going to share my presentation here, and see if I can get it to actually operate. No, it looks like it's being a little bit tricky. So I think, oh, here we go. Okay, it was doing this a little bit before, kind of this on and off thing. It'll settle down. So anyway, I'm going to basically talk about.
It hasn't settled down yet.
Yeah.
We're staying blank.
Funny. Huh. Let's see if it will. It's not. Maybe now.
Nope. You're on mute, Barbara. Maybe that's because you're cursing to yourself.
No, yeah, it was weird. It said Zoom quit unexpectedly.
Oh, that was.
Okay, let's try this again.
Okay. Okay, we're seeing that. That's looks good.
Let's keep our fingers crossed and hope this works. Yes. Okay, great. I'm not gonna mess with it. I'm just gonna go slide by slide and not try to get it into actual slide mode. So I'll skip over the first page of this spread. That was just a cover page. So when Margaret asked me to talk about pollinator gardens, as I said, I was really excited about it because I basically said to her, well, that pretty much covers everything that I do. But she suggested that I focus on design principles, ways to maximize the aesthetics of pollinator landscaping and using native plants. So that is what I'm going to do. So we have a lot of ground to cover, but I'm going to be quick. To narrow things down, I'm first going to focus on just sort of overall goals and opportunities for pollinator gardens, essential design concepts, hopefully organized in a easy to grasp way, and trying to get my cursor to work here. There we go. And then kind of the role that maintenance plays in ongoing design. I'll also share some opportunities, some resources. So this is still acting a little bit quirky here. I'm not getting my slides. There, nope. It's
try the arrows.
Yeah, let me try. I'm actually I'm gonna stop sharing and try to start again.
Okay.
Let me try this one. Okay.
Oh, it's working.
This one seems to be working, but it's not forwarding.
Okay. That's a problem.
There we go. Okay. Stay there. Okay, so starting with the basics, what is a pollinator garden and why have one? So it is a garden that is planted predominantly with plants that provide nectar or pollen for a wide range of pollinating insects, bees, butterflies, moths, etc., hummingbirds. It primarily, although not necessarily exclusively, uses native plants. Ductalamy and research has suggested that the goal overall should be 70% native plants. And most importantly, it does not use pesticides. So here on the right, a silver spotted skipper butterfly has graciously cooperated by posing on a Joe Pye wheat to illustrate the benefits of this message. I mean, that is really, really critical. A pollinator benefit obviously has many benefits. That's why we want them. They're beautiful. They support our ecosystem. And perhaps most importantly, they help us maintain our sanity in these very strange times. And I guarantee you that once you get started, you are going to want to get more and more involved. You're going to get curious about what's visiting your gardens. You're going to be fascinated by the amount of activity you have in your garden. So let's talk about pollinator garden opportunities. A pollinator garden can assume many forms and purposes. Let's take this photo. I do not know where it is located. I pulled it off the internet. It reflects a very typical suburban residential property with lots of lawn, non-native evergreen foundation shrubs lined up against the house, exotic grasses and shrubs, and a lone tree in the middle of the lawn. Here, there are many opportunities to create pollinator gardens. You could replace the non-native evergreen foundation plants with native foundation flowering beds. You could reduce lawn in a lot of places around the foundation, near a new walkway, permeable walkway and along the street. You can install a pollinator rain garden to capture the runoff from the front downspouts. You could add another small flowering tree and a welcoming conservation landscape along the street, and the list goes on. So how do we approach this? When we think about design, there are several essential steps. First, we have to understand the site specifics and the location and the purpose of the garden. Second, we need to think about the basic design principles and how to apply them. And finally, we need to develop an appropriate plant palette and select the right plants in the right quantities and sizes. So the first and most essential step is to know your site. At the beginning of every project, I start with a site analysis where I document existing conditions and plants. I try to understand and categorize the site type, and there may be multiple site types on a property. I also do take a soil sample to understand what's going on with the soil. That's important. Here I show examples of the four most common types of site conditions or characteristics from the upper left going clockwise. Forest, is your site shady, full of a lot of canopy trees? Is it like a forest? Or is it sunny? In which case it's more like a grassland or prairie. Or is it like a woodlands, an edge zone, where you have some shade trees, some understory trees, and then finally on the lower left, is it wet? Is it like a floodplain? Are there water issues? In some sense, every property can be characterized in some sense into these categories. And then these categories give you clues to the types of plants that grow well together, because every one of these site types has a series of plant communities that grow within it well. And plants like to grow within their communities, with their friends. And then that creates like a synergistic environment for the plants to grow. So you want plant friends to grow together in their respective plant community, and you want that to be matched appropriately to your site. The next step, come on. Now I seem to be stuck. There we go. Come on. One more. The next step is to understand your own design principles. And why is this important? Because unless you live in a rural area, it's probably important to you how your garden looks, particularly if it's highly visible or you live in an HOA. At the end of this presentation, I list a number of design books, which I have found very helpful. One of them, shown here, Planting a New Perspective by Piet Udolf and Noel Kingsbury, in which they state planting which serves a purpose has to look good too. It's helpful to keep that in mind, depending on your goals. We want a functional pollinator landscape, but we want to keep aesthetics in mind as well. So that's why we think about these design principles. One of the first questions to think about is, what are your own or your HOA's expectations with regard to design aesthetics? What is the goal? Is it a kind of wild or natural look, or is it a more formal look? Both of them are fine. What's important is what you strive for. It may depend on the location of the garden or its purpose. Native plant landscapes can be loose, such as on the left, or structured and refined, such as on the right. I did not design the landscape on the right, but I do see this approach on occasion. It relies on native plants, but it's more formalistic, and it might fit certain aesthetic standards. There are 3 native plants on the right: Joe Pyeweed, mountain mint, and switchgrass. And they're planted in wide blocks, big blocks, and it does create a more formalistic look. Understanding your goals is what is important. If your goal is to rely also on native plant species only, which is commendable, you'll want to take this account into your design. Cultivars can be used to achieve a less wild look. Many are bred to be more compact or disease resistant. I'm not here to argue for or against cultivars. Research on the differences in wildlife value of cultivars is ongoing. But even with the use of cultivars, there's a lot of pollinator action going on compared to the traditional non-native landscape or the turf landscape. So they have some value in helping people bridge that gap. Next up is to define your planting areas and have a planting plan. Your garden might be delineated by hardscape, as on the left, or loosely defined with edging. Either way, you want to think about how your plants are arranged. The pictures on the left were taken at a pollinator garden at Georgetown Waterfront Park in March and again in July. And you can see the very well-defined planting arrangement of grasses and perennials in the March picture. You can see it, how they were planted. And then come July, you can see how they melded together in an aesthetically pleasing way, which actually gives the impression that there is no design, and that's no accident. On the right is a meadow that was planted in April, and again, how it appeared in August. Here, the plants again were laid out by a deliberate plan. It was not random. Yet again, the effect looks natural and yet aesthetically pleasing, and it's not an accident. The order created by the planting plan provides a way to create that naturalistic look, not leaving it to chance. Here are a few examples of designs so that you can see how, with a process of laying out plants on paper before you actually put them in the ground. The 2 on the top are just very simple conservation landscapes, and the block areas, the colored blocks on the left, and areas on the right, they're not colored in. They represent spaces where a single type of perennial or grass was planted. And then the bottom plan is a larger backyard plan that I did recently with hardscape and pathways, but the same principle applies, where you see these kind of irregularly shaped blocks. Those are blocks of single types of perennials or grasses to give it impact, and they're not just randomly placed. So next, when coming up with your plant palette and your planting plan, take your cues from nature and think layers. Layers restore the landscape, allow it to mimic nature. Design your garden in layers, using small trees, flowering shrubs, perennials, and finally on the bottom, grasses and sedges. Each layer plays a role and mimics nature, creating the best environment for all sorts of pollinators and wildlife. Planting in layers means first selecting a dense ground layer to act as green mulch. Shown here, starting from the left clockwise, are some of my favorite ground layer plants: social sedge, Cherokee sedge, foam flower. On the bottom row, heath aster, moss phlox, golden groundsel, and wild geranium. All are native. None of these have to come in the form of cultivars. And depending on your site, there's just many different ground layers in addition to this to choose from. But this is sort of your green mulch carpet layer. The next layer is your herbaceous seasonal perennial layer that offers botanical diversity. It will provide those blooms throughout the spring, summer, and fall. Shown here are some of my favorites: black-eyed Susan, butterfly weed, purple coneflower, monarda, bee balm, and aster, New York aster. And then finally, your structural layer is composed of woodies and taller perennials and grasses that act as an enduring framework for the entire creation. They provide backbone and structure through all seasons. If woodies, they are providing the more permanent branch backbone. If taller grasses, they provide movement in the warm seasons and firmer structure in the winter when you leave them standing and they dry out. And if taller perennials, they simply stand taller above the seasonal perennials. Shown here clockwise from the upper left are woodies, inkberry, Virginia sweetspire, smooth witherrod, and summer sweet. And then on the bottom layer, you've got grasses, switchgrass and little blue stem, and then the taller perennials, swamp milkweed, gay feather, and anise hyssop. So taken together, these pictures, coming back to these pictures, represent layered approaches to gardening. On the left, you've got on the ground level, Cherokee sedge and golden groundsel. On the sort of the seasonal layer, you've got allium, purple coneflower, butterfly weed, black-eyed Susan, providing that seasonal blooming and blooming throughout. And then in the structural layer, you have switchgrass, little blue stem, anise hyssop, and inkberry. And you know, I realize it's hard to actually see these different structures in this picture, and that's the whole idea. They blend together, they work together as sort of in concert. And at different parts of the year, you can see some more than others. But when it's all happening in summer, they all meld together. On the right, we have the ground covered with foam flower and carex, which you actually can't see here. The perennial layer, the mid-level, is Monarda bradburyana. That's one of my favorite bee balms, alum root, and coneflower. And then your structural layer is inkberry, summer sweet, and oak leaf hydrangea. So when you're thinking about choosing plants, choose plants that are appropriate for your site based on its conditions, its type, its community. Use plants with a variety of bloom times and textures, heights, colors, shapes, contrast, etc. And arrange them. Think about the arrangement of them. Try to develop a planting plan, as discussed earlier. You want your arrangement to mimic nature. So just look at how nature does it. Take a walk in parks and see how nature organizes the plants in the plant community. Plant in groups and masses. That's really helpful for impact. And repeat those masses to create rhythm and balance in your gardens. And also be very careful to space your plants appropriately. Go by the recommended guidelines for plant types. Space them whether it's 12 inches apart, 18 inches apart, 24, 36, depending on how large the plant's going to get. And then finally, make sure to plan for spreading and growth. And that is one of the reasons why you plant according to the recommended spacing. If you plant too thinly, you're going to create more work for yourself weeding. If you plant too far apart, you're going to have big gaps. I have heard a lot that the recommended spacing for plants that you'll see on websites and nursery websites is actually probably as far apart as you want to plant. And depending on your budget, you may want to plant a little bit closer to that if you want immediate impact. But if you're willing to wait a year or two, then go by the guidelines and be patient and know that you will have to do some weeding. Okay, let's see if we can get this to, it's gone asleep again. There we go. Let's go, we already went there. one more. Okay. Always in your planting, try to create and maintain strong edges in your gardens and your garden areas. Edges can be hardscape. It can be a driveway. It can be lawn edging, as in the middle, where you see a nice sharp edge with the lawn area, and you've got your bed over here. The important thing is to make sure the boundary of your garden is well defined and maintained, so it doesn't appear haphazard. That's one of the key findings of people who have kind of looked into naturalistic landscaping, how to make it acceptable, how to make it aesthetically pleasing. A lot of talk is about the edging. And then finally, in your design, try to create a sense of mystery and retreat so you really enjoy the journey. Mystery magically happens when you have paths or stairways that twist and turn, create a walking path around various habitats and elements of your garden. And then finally, think about maintenance as an ongoing design, not a chore. Your pollinator garden is an evolving creation. You will need to regularly maintain it by thinning, weeding, and controlling competition among the plants. Get to know your plants and which ones are bullies. Manage this process and thin them accordingly. A plant that is a bully is not necessarily a bad thing. You just need to control it. And you don't need to remove them, but keep an eye on them. A lot of seasonal perennials get too tall. They flop over in later summer. You can cut them back in late May or early June, and most will still bloom as usual. And they'll be in a more manageable, shorter form. So get to know which perennials benefit from this, and it may take a season or two. Finally, embrace the seasons in both your design and ongoing design maintenance. Take pleasure in the spent blooms. No need to deadhead unless it helps neaten things up a bit or you want repeat blooms. Enjoy the fall leaves, leave them, shred them, provide shelter for insects and wildlife, and leave those tall grasses standing until March arrives. They take on a truly beautiful look over the winter. And don't forget nesting and shelter for insects and other wildlife. They need more than just flowers. Leave the leaves, save the stems, and plant a log. Nest sites can be artificial or natural. This is a mason bee home that got a lot of activity in my yard this year. The other pictures are examples of egg-laying places or winter shelter. Leaving dead canes and dead grass stems in place, piles of dead hollow twigs and stems provide nest sites for cavity nesting species. And rotting and decomposing logs also provide nesting sites. So even with all this neat wildness, you can maintain clean garden borders with rocks or woods that maintain a tidy aesthetic. So here I list some of my favorite design and plant community resources. These are all incredible books that are truly helpful. I want to point your attention to the last book, Spira, Wildflowers and Plant Communities. That's really an excellent book that helps you make that connection between those four types of plant communities and what plants go together in those communities, what native plants. So that's a terrific resource. Okay, so that is my presentation. And now I'm going to move into a discussion of the photos that have been submitted. I think we got about 7 photo groupings, and I'll go through each of those and kind of just summarize what the questions were and what some of my suggestions are. And then I know a number of you also submitted questions, really terrific questions, and we'll walk through those questions and time permitting, take additional ones. Does that sound like a good plan, Margaret?
It sounds like a perfect plan.
Okay, good. Okay, so this photo was sent in with the question, what can take the place of the liriope? The lower left-hand side gets full sun, the other areas get partial sun. And the person who wrote in envisioned colorful perennials lining the walk on either side, but not too high. So liriope is something that I am very, very familiar with, having been guilty of planting, I'd say a medium-sized quantity of it about 25 years ago on my property, and I am still battling with getting it out. And when you do take out liriope, I mean, it comes out with huge masses of soil because those roots are so dense. And as you can see, just like what you see here, they don't let anything else grow. When liriope takes over a patch like this, nothing else is allowed to grow. So my recommendation here would be to pull out that liriope and replace it with a mix of native sedge and perennials. Now, because some of the areas get sun and some only get partial sun, I think you can work with that. I don't think that's an issue at all. You can leverage that actually. If you want a uniform look, you could use the same sedge on both sides. Sedges that look really nice that take the place of liriope, there are a couple that are semi-evergreen or evergreen, Carex blanda, Carex ambola, Carex laxicolmus. Look at the various species of Carex and pick one. If you want that evergreen look in the winter, you can replicate it. And maybe plant the same sedge on both sides of the path, but for the sunnier side, you could choose perennials that would actually be sun loving and some on the other side that are more suitable for shady. So on the sunnier side, you could pick threadleaf tickseed is a really nice kind of well-behaved yellow flowers, medium high, not too aggressive. And then some of the asters that are for fall blooming that are not so tall, like a bushy aster. And then some of the sun-loving phloxes could go on the left. On the shadier side, you could think about mixing in with the Carex, the sedge, you could mix in wild geranium, foam flower, euchera, alum root, and some of the chelones, Chelonia obliqua, which give really bright pink flowers that really stand out in a shady area. And any of these selections, because you're getting rid of the liriope, the perennials will grow and coexist with the sedge. So the sedge won't take over, and they won't be too overwhelming for your walkway, and yet would provide that color that you need. So that's kind of my suggestions for that one. This next one came in with the comments, my front yard has become a combination of Japanese iris, hosta, various volunteer grasses, and plants from my neighbors. The last photo shows a volunteer plant. What is it? What should I keep it? I enjoy a natural looking garden, but not one that is out of control. That's true for all of us. I'd also like some evergreens to grace the garden in the winter. That's true too. A lot of us feel that way. So, I'll start with the easy one answer first, which is that the photo on the left looks to me like a volunteer crepe myrtle. It's very common to see this. My recommendation is to get rid of it quickly, or it will spread. You'll have more little miniature crepe myrtles growing everywhere. I guess the main question I would ask here is decide how far you want to go. Decide if you want to start over. You've got a lot of non-native plants here. If you want to have a sustainable garden, to be honest, as a designer, my recommendation would be to start with basically a blank canvas. You got some really interesting features here that looks like a big rock. Looks like there might be one on the other side. I would, think that you could do some interesting slope side plantings here. You could have definitely some shrubs, providing kind of a naturalistic structure and erosion control along the slope. And you could even plant a small tree or two in the front, something that likes sun, because it looks like you have some sun there. But I would start, if you're not sure you want to do sort of a wholesale, from scratch design, I would start with pulling out the invasives. And particularly the grasses, it looks like you have miscanthus. Miscanthus is an invasive, and it will spread pretty aggressively and usually gets, again, like liriope, it grows so big and nothing else can stand in its way or grow with it. It doesn't like to share space. So that's what I would kind of recommend here. You have a lot of room to experiment here, a lot of potential, and I think, and you have full sun, which actually increases your options. So you have a lot of things that you can do here. I will say that in terms of the evergreens, that is true too. But the choice of evergreens when it comes to native plants is relatively limited, but there are certainly some that you can use, particularly in that structural layer. There are a number of shrubs like inkberry, the bayberries, Some of the junipers that that you can use that are native that provide that evergreen. So those could all be options in your design. Okay, now it has gone to sleep again, so we're going to try to wait for it to wake up. There we go. Okay, now I'll have to go forward. The next question while we're waiting. Come on. There we go. Coming. Okay, one more. Okay. All right. The next question asked, what could we do here besides azaleas? And they have a more slope. So my first question would be, is this site shady or sunny? It's hard to tell from the picture. It's close up. It looks like front of the house. Either way, there's lots of room for native shrubs and perennials to fill in the foundation. You could add native shrubs in front of the azaleas. I'm not sure if there's room behind them. It's hard to tell. Some of my favorite native shrubs to add in front of existing non-native or behind non-native evergreen shrubs are Virginia sweetspire and summer sweet. And those are shrubs that can take sun or shade. For shrubs that as a more shady site, I would say some of the native hydrangeas would add some more color there and more natural sort of shape. For the moist slope, I would recommend creating a defined edge for the area and plant a ground layer such as golden groundsel, Pachyra aurea, or a sedge for starters. And then you could go on to add moisture and shade-loving perennials like cardinal flower, Ampsonia, or some of the asters. Now the next photo is the person sending it in said this is a bed that they're making into a pollinator garden in front of their house as an example to neighbors on planting natives, and they would love general tips or ideas, and it gets full afternoon sun. So this looks like a great bed with tremendous potential, and I love the wall. It looks like it's sunny on the outer side, probably might get a little shade or some root competition under the tree. Although she says it's full afternoon sun. Can't quite tell what kind of a tree it is, but I would suggest first a ground layer that would spill over the wall, something like moss phlox or heath aster for fall flowers. And that would be your ground layer. Provided there's room, I can't quite tell how large it is, but maybe a few low shrubs to provide that winter interest in that layered structure, like Virginia sweetspire that takes sun and shade. And then a variety of 3 or 4 perennials. I'd put sunnier perennials on the left side, something like Ampsonia, blue star flower, purple cone flower, black-eyed Susan, and then perhaps if it is a little less sunny towards the tree, something that's a little bit more shade tolerant, like alum root, euchera, or foam flower. So I have this neat little tool that kind of lets me take photos and sort of, have some fun by seeing what plants might look like. And while it's a little cartoonish looking, but that's kind of the fun of it. And some of the plant images are not native, but I try to kind of pull plant images that have the same general shape that the native plants would. And so you've got, you can see what, like if it were spring flowering pink moss phlox on the left, and the way the heath aster would spill over the wall on the right, but that's pictured there is not a native plant. But picture something imagine something that does have like white flowers or something. And then you can just kind of see what it would look like with the taller perennials, sun-loving perennials on the left that I mentioned. Behind you can see these, the Virginia sweetspire kind of providing that structure. And in the winter, that would provide more interest, leaving them standing. And then foam flower under the tree providing more of a ground cover that would take some of that root competition and shade. So the next one is the person sent it in, said, I have cleared an area on my lawn, approximately 14 by 15 feet, to plant a butterfly pollinator garden. What plants do you recommend? Do you have any design tips that will help this garden be a success? That is, plant in groups of 3 or 5. Is it better to plant the new plants in the fall or the spring? And where can I purchase affordable plants or seeds from? So I have some ideas, which would be to, again, put something on the ground. I'll actually, let's see, there we go. Okay. So I would recommend a ground layer, that something like Cherokee sedge, which takes sun as that ground layer. I would also recommend, again here, a few small-ish shrubs like the Virginia sweet spire. I've pictured that again, maybe 3, kind of arranged, and to provide that structure. And then groups of, I've got switchgrass in here, purple coneflower, anise hyssop, and black-eyed Susan. And those will provide blooms throughout the season. I also have some coreopsis in the front, some threadleaf tick seed, and to provide that lower. So higher in the middle and towards the back, and lower in the front. You could all, not pictured here, but I would also recommend adding an early spring bloomer, pollinator like beard tongue, Penstemon digitalis, would start blooming very early. Now in the back, if you want to be really bold, you could plant cup flower seeds. And cup flower is very easy to grow from seed, and it ultimately grows to 9 to 10 feet tall. It actually provides a really wonderful backdrop, or even against a fence. It is like an unbelievable butterfly magnet. And so if you really wanted to be bold, you could kind of go that distance. It does self-seed, but it's also pretty easy to control because you can sort of see where they are and pull them out. So when to plant? Fall is a great time to plant. I don't like to wait too late into the fall to plant perennials. So I wouldn't, not too far after November. Early spring is also a great time. They're both pretty good. Fall gives you the advantage of having the plants be in the ground. They can develop their roots over the winter, so they get a little more of a jump start on the next year. And where can I purchase affordable plants or seeds from? So if you're like most people, there's a lot of retail sources of native plants here. Ursanga, of course, is the best. And there's a number of native plant retail nurseries here, which I would recommend. Seeds, there's a lot of different sources that you can purchase seeds from, either on the internet or that's probably the best bet. Personally, I go to wholesale nurseries. They give me a much broader choice of native plants and availability, and I can basically go where I need to get what plants I want, which is difficult when you're going to retail nurseries. You're subject to basically what they have. So, but that's not usually available to, unless you have a wholesale account. So, but there's plenty of places to purchase affordable plants here. Then a couple more we got. Photo, let's see, this person sent in these photos, and it was a little unclear exactly what the question was, other than maybe just general reactions. And so actually, if the person who submitted these photos is here and wants to unmute, maybe that might be a great way to approach this.
Sure, Barbara. It's Liz here.
Yes, hi.
Yeah, my question is, I have a lot of shade front and back, and the front is steeply sloped. And so these, the pictures in the top and bottom left quadrant on my screen with our rock retaining beds around 2 silver maples, and then in between those 2 beds, which you can see in that lower left, is a small patch of grass. And then And that's the driveway. There's a long, narrow bed against the front of the house at the top of the hill, with significant shade under a dogwood and a Asian maple. And then the backyard is long and sloped along the fence line. So it's all shade. You know, maybe 2 to 3 hours in the backyard of direct sun, but no direct sun any other time.
Mm-hmm. There's lots and lots of native plants that do really well in shade. So I think part of it is, and I think one of the questions I would have is, do I can see some of the plants I see here, like there's a lot of variegated Solomon seal. I mean, are you interested in supplementing what you have or replacing what you have? That would be the question.
I have a lot of natives. I'm interested in supplementing where I need to fill out the gaps. Yeah.
Right. So for shade and for slope control, you know, Pachyra aurea golden groundsel is really wonderful. It is a pretty competitive plant. It's great when you want to fill in spaces. It's gorgeous in the spring with the yellow flowers. You know, I think I generally like to plant golden groundsel in, well, I'll call it confined spaces where it will stay within that spot. But if you can control it, it's just a really wonderful plant that will fill in areas, and it looks like you have some of those confined spaces that you could let it go and you could probably control it. Another one of my favorite plants for shade is Euchera. The native forms of Euchera villosa, and alum root is another word for it. And that actually is fairly, it's semi-evergreen, and they can, when they like where they are, which they probably would here, depending on your soil, but if there's nothing unusual about it, they can grow very, they're almost like small shrubs, and they do really beautifully. Tiarella is another one, the foam flower, wild geranium would go really nicely here. Wild ginger would do really nicely. So there's a long list of native plants that do very well in shade, and they are equally valuable. They're pollinator, you know, pollinators go crazy for them. And I think part of it is some of them are a little more woodlandy than others. I love black cohosh is a phenomenal plant. It's a little more woodlandy. So it depends how much you want your yard to look like a woodland area. But those can grow beautifully, and they actually will kind of self-sow, but in a nice way. Does that help?
It does. Great, thank you. What was the species on the Euchera that you mentioned?
So Euchera villosa is that's the species. If you are open to cultivars, Autumn Bride is fabulous. It has white flowers. It's just it's a really great performing plant, and just in general, it's just done really well.
Someone was suggesting ferns.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's sort of an obvious one. Yeah, ferns would obviously go beautifully here. Any kind of ferns, the native ferns. If you want evergreen, Christmas fern, the wood fern are evergreen and would provide that, you know, that you'd have that kind of all winter. But it would be great. Okay, now we've gone to sleep again. We have one more photo question, and I have the same question here. There we go. Okay. Which is somebody sent this in, and I wasn't quite sure about what the question was. So maybe if that person is on the line who submitted this question, I'm sorry I don't have their name right handy. If so, just speak up. One of the questions actually that
Hi, it's Jan.
Great.
So this is my question is I've started to this is an enlarged bed that actually had ended back where I guess where the bird bath is, if you can see that. We enlarged it because that area was still getting water. We did some drainage, the drainage in there because we have some existing French drains that water was going to. So that took care of the water problem, and then I had this area that I could plant in. So I've moved some shrubs from the back in, and they're native, the sweet spire and the clethra, and the beautyberry is over on the left. And then I have obviously some non-natives that I had transplanted from elsewhere in the garden, like the irises, the Siberian iris, and the daylilies. But then I have that whole other area that I could use as a pollinator garden. And I guess that now that I've seen the other photos that you provided and the other ideas, I can use those too. But anything else that you can suggest, and it gets pretty much full sun. It's what exposure would you say? I think actually it's more of an eastern. It's like a northeastern exposure, but not. You can see that any of the shade is just hollies that are in the back there. So it gets a lot of afternoon. I guess, well, it shouldn't be afternoon, it should be morning. That would be west. But anyway, it gets enough sun so that in the back, we have a productive vegetable garden. So if you could see that.
Yeah, okay, so that's helpful, thank you. So I'm looking at the picture. There's the area on the right that looks like it's kind of waiting for something to happen there.
That's right.
And if as you say, it gets sun,
yes.
Yes, I would just kind of pick a variety. You're lucky you have sun, and so pick a variety of blooming perennials that you could put there. A combination. Given the size, I can't quite tell exactly how big it is, but I wouldn't go with more than maybe three.
Three. Okay, that's what I needed to know.
Yeah, and think about that ground layer, and then of those three, plant in at least groups of three. So
okay.
So if you put in, 9 plants, 3 different types of plants, get 3 of each, and just kind of put them together. And the plants that I have found to be the easiest to grow, kind of the most rewarding, Black-eyed Susan is a cannot fail plant, and just the basic.
I have it all throughout there. The only problem is it's that whole idea, and I have a sedum that you can't see that's behind the beautyberry, so I could bring that out too. But it's that whole flopping, and it's continuous, even though I divide it. But you said about the cutting it back in May or June, so maybe that'll help.
Yeah, the other thing, right, the beautyberry, I'll make a recommendation on beautyberry, which is I love beautyberry. It's like my favorite shrub. I cut it back hard every spring to like.
Okay, thank you for telling me that. Okay.
Yeah,
right.
And it pops back to 6 to 8 feet tall.
Okay. Okay.
But you don't need to be too, worried about.
Good. Okay. Thank you. What lowest layer would you recommend?
I couldn't hear that.
What is the first layer that you would recommend? I do have a neighbor who wants to give me some phlox, but I'm not sure that it's the native that you were recommending. It might be more of a cultivar. I'm not sure if it's, yeah.
Right. Well, as I said, I don't have any objections to cultivars,
okay.
particularly, and actually from a designer standpoint, they're often very helpful in just making sure, because most of them are designed to be more compact in nature or disease resistant, and they just, they're good for home environments, particularly if people care about those attributes. So the phloxes, though, most of the phloxes are shade loving.
Okay.
There are a few The phlox subulata, which is moss phlox, which blooms early spring. It is a
Yeah,
ground.
that's the one I'm talking about.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. I mean, I would definitely put that in. It'll do really well, give you that burst of color in the spring. And it's actually evergreen. It stays, it covers the ground throughout the year. So it's a wonderful thing to do. The other one I would recommend is heath aster, Aster ericoides. Acts the same as moss phlox, grows a little bit bushier and has wonderful white flowers in the fall, just when nothing else is blooming. So it's one of the asters. So it's really wonderful.
Okay,
Um,
that's great.
Most of the calyxes, the sedges require sun. As I've mentioned, the Cherokee sedge actually though takes some shade, so or takes some sun. So most sedges require shade, and the Cherokee sedge is kind of one exception that will take sun.
Okay,
And I do love that one.
okay, great.
Okay.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Sure. I think so while we wait for the computer to wake up, I'm actually done. That was the last of the photos that have been sent in. There were a number of questions that were emailed. So Margaret, does it make sense for me to go through those questions?
Sure, and then we'll do the chat questions. And maybe this would be a good time for me to make a suggestion that Barbara would be way too polite to do, which is, you all know the expression measure twice, cut once. This is a plug for considering hiring a landscape professional to at least get you started. Certainly what I have found is that in 2 days they can do what took me 2 decades to accomplish and do it way better. But anyway, please go ahead, Barbara.
Okay. So there were a number of questions that basically said what to grow in heavy shade. And this relates to one of the photos we were just talking about. And I lumped these all together. And I'm going to give you kind of I'm going to tick off my list of things. Ferns, which I forgot to mention, the photo are top of my list for what to plant in shade. Any of the carex species are wonderful. And there's a lot of shade-loving perennials. Some of my favorites, I mentioned black cohosh for a woodland environment, goat's beard, same thing, Canadian ginger, blue wood aster, turtlehead, green and gold, bleeding heart, coral bells, which is also euchra or alum root, and dwarf crested iris, cardinal flower, Virginia bluebells, the native form of Pachysandra, Allegheny spurge, golden ragwort that we've talked about, Pachara, and a number of the phloxes, wood phlox, creeping phlox, foam flower. And in the shrub world, summer sweet fothergilla, the native hydrangea, smooth hydrangea, oak leaf hydrangea, the Virginia sweet spire, spice bush, maple leaf viburnum, and black hall viburnum are all some of my favorite shade-loving plants. So don't worry if you have shade, there's plenty to plant. Next question, set of questions. We got a couple questions about erosion control and suggestions. What I would, and also erosion control with runoff involved or wetness. So when it comes to shrubs, yes, St. John's wort is great. Also Rhus aromatic, the low form of sumac, is called Grow Low. It is a cultivar, but it's fabulous for slopes. The other shrubs that are good for slopes, New Jersey tea or summer sweet, those are all good for stabilization. And there's a number of grasses that you can use on slopes. If you have sun, you can use switchgrass, little blue stem. A lot of perennials that do well on slopes, Baptisia. And then you can always fill in the space on the slopes with Pachara, a ground cover like Pachara, or some of the carex species. Carex amphibola is really good for erosion control as well. We got a question about pruning. When to prune natives back in the timing. So basically for shrubs, you can prune any time of year for shrubs. You don't need to worry about that. But I find early spring is kind of the best. Put it on your schedule. Think about doing it. For some of those things like the calocarpa, like the American beautyberry, prune them back hard and don't worry about it. You can also do that with things like elderberry. You can prune them back hard after they've been in the ground for a couple of years. The ones that just get really too big. And in terms of perennials, I really like to prune in early summer. Sometimes it can kind of give me a knot in my stomach right when everything's beginning to bush out and get green. It's like, you know, June, the perennials are finally coming up and you see the buds there. It's like, it's so hard to pull out your clippers and cut them. But believe me, for most of them, particularly if you're space constrained, you'll be thankful later because, you know, you won't have that flopping over problem as much. Somebody sent a question about the easiest types of steps to install on a hillside to make it accessible without creating non-permeable areas. So if you have a steep slope on a hillside and you want it to be non-permeable, which is commendable, you know, you could box in the steps with timber and you could fill it with mulch or gravel, and that would be almost completely permeable. You can also use boulder steps. They do, obviously the part of the boulder is not permeable, but they're basically set in the existing earth, and there's and they don't add too much impervious space. I love this question: which pollinator attracting plants would do well in containers? So that's a really fun thing to do. One of the reasons I love to plant native plants in containers is because at the end of the season, instead of pulling out the annuals and tossing them in the compost or the trash, I get to put them in the ground. So you get double duty from them actually, and it compounds over time because they're in the ground then for as long as you want them. When I do containers, you know, and the sort of the idea behind containers is you have a thriller, you have a filler, and you have a spiller. So you have these three different types of plants you combine. For the taller plants, you could have a grass, you could have any of the grasses. You could try the little blue stem, you could try switchgrass. And then for the fillers, I have found Coreopsis threadleaf tickseed does really well, as do some of the bushy asters, the lower growing asters. And so that gives you blooms basically from the summer through the fall. Echinacea and black-eyed Susans do really well to provide that kind of filler, that height. And then you could have on the layer, if you wanted more to be spilling over, you could have some carex grasses. So there's really no you know, nothing you can't try. I would just say experiment with it. And then the beauty of it is, if it doesn't work out great, you can still put it in your yard somewhere when the season's over. Continual bloom. A couple of questions about continual bloom. How do you ensure continual bloom? And that's, of course, one of the main things about natives is that you do not, unlike annuals, they don't bloom continually. You need to have a mix of natives that bloom at different times and space them accordingly so that you have that look of something blooming all the time. There are a few that do bloom a long time, not as long as an annual necessarily. I have found that Agastache, Anis hyssop, blooms a really long time in the summer. It's a fabulous performer, as is Coreopsis, as I've mentioned, threadleaf tickseed. The Euchera, the coral bells, the alum root, that they bloom a long time, and certain of the Monardas, Monarda bradburyana, I mentioned that earlier, that's one of my favorites. Of course, Echinacea blooms like profusely throughout the summer, and black-eyed Susan. So, you know, if you stick to those core, I'll call them, those are the workhorse bloomers. And then if you know, and then add on fringes some other things that bloom at certain times of the year, like asters and penstemons, to get that extension and early season effect. And then a question came in: plants we can grow this season that would be helpful for pollinators that overwinter here. I think it's less about what plants we grow as what we do with them after the season. So leave them standing, and leave the grasses and all your spent blooms standing over the winter, and that will give the pollinators what they need. They need a place to nest. They need a place for shelter, and so that's the best thing to provide them. Let's see, there was a question about, as any negatives to mixing annual flowers to a native landscape? Absolutely not. I mean, and actually native gardens, if you find that you have space there, just throw down some seeds, some annual seeds. It doesn't do any harm. It fills it in, and it's better than having bare ground there. Let's see, somebody, a couple of questions came in about, let's see, pollinator plants that bloom in the spring and any that are evergreen. The spring bloomers, moss phlox, wood phlox, penstemon, beard tongue, Baptisia, false indigo, Pachyra, golden groundsel, Monarda, Monarda bradburyana, again, Coreopsis, and of course your spring ephemerals. Those are the things that bloom in the spring, and so they're wonderful. And then in terms of evergreens, particularly for shrubs, inkberry, juniper, American holly, and the bayberry, southern and the northern bayberry. So somebody asked a question about plantings of milkweed, and I love this question. They asked plantings of milkweed to support monarch butterfly reproduction, because monarchs prefer to lay eggs on common milkweed, Asclepis syriaca. So that's a really interesting question. I actually participate in the one of the monarch citizen science projects where you actually keep track of monarch eggs and caterpillars over several months. On my property, I have at least 3 different types of milkweed growing. And so I actually I've observed this, and it is true that monarchs seem to prefer to lay eggs on the common milkweed. Particularly, I found the most eggs on, I'll call it the young volunteers, not the older common milkweed that would come up and grow really big and have the big pods, but the little ones that kind of sprung up on their own, which you're tempted maybe to pull out because they're not where you want them to be. That was just like hands down the favorite place for monarchs to lay eggs. But interestingly, I found more instars, or the caterpillars, as they grow. You have 5 stages of instars. I found more instars on the orange type of milkweed and the swamp milkweed. I can't explain that other than the fact that it's harder to see milkweed eggs on the other types of milkweed because the leaves are smaller, so they're just harder to observe. But I'm not sure that the research is conclusive about which type of milkweed plant is the best for butterfly reproduction. I think research is still ongoing, and it varies. I mean, my recommendation would be plant as many as you can. Avoid the exotic kind that they sometimes sell in nurseries. Make sure you're planting one of the ones that are truly native to Virginia. And I also would recommend, if you're really interested, engaging one of the citizen science projects and starting to track it. Anybody can get trained, anybody can do that. And then there was a last question I'll mention. There was a question about creating a best strategy for creating a native meadow on existing 3 acres of brush and grass. That is a complicated question. 3 acres is a lot of land, and that's a big meadow. And I think my best recommendation there is to get help and have a strategy, get knowledgeable help, and have a strategy for removing the brush and grass. That's kind of the first thing that you can do to ensure your success, is make sure that you have a strategy for removing that grass, and either a strategy for seeding or sodding or planting plants and the right mix. So it's we could have 5 different webinars just on creating meadows. So that's a complicated one, but that's kind of as far as I'll go on that question. So that's what I have. You have questions in the chat. Should I take down the share and we can?
Yeah, that's good. All right, so we had many very interesting questions come in. So one of them, so first of all, of course, whenever you feel like you need to go, we'll just end it. And one of the questions was, can we have a list of your plants? And I would say, we don't want to give Barbara homework, but this is recorded. So, and also many of this stuff is on the Plant Nova Natives website, and anything that isn't on there yet, I plan to put up there. So look for it there. All right, so the first question was, How do you decide on a size and height of each patch? Absolutely, and in relation to an entire bed.
Say that at each what? Each what?
Each patch.
Each patch.
So like this came in when you were talking about your planting plans.
Yeah. Well, size and height of each patch. A little bit sort of just comes from the gut, looking at the site and thinking about it. But the size of each sort of patch or swath, you know, you don't want it to be too small. You want it to accommodate a minimum of 3 to 5 plants so that you have that impact. And also then it would just get too small to even manage if you had too many patches. So you want to have that impact. The height is going to be dependent on your mix of plants, and so and it depends sort of on the layout of whatever you're designing and what it abuts to, what it's up against. If it's against a pathway, you probably want it to be a graduated height unless it's very narrow, and you might want that vertical impact. So I would say the answer to the question is it's site specific. I wish I had a better answer for you than that, but that's really the gist of it.
Okay, thanks. Now, what do you think about mosses as a substitute for grass in a backyard?
So if you have a situation where you have moss, consider yourself lucky. It's a wonderful substitute for lawn, and I would nurture it. I think moss is fantastic, and so it's and most mosses, to tell you the truth, it's interesting because a lot of the mosses you see, I mean, you think about native moss, non-native moss. Some of the mosses are like native everywhere in the world. So I wouldn't worry about that. If you have something that's growing and you like it, I would nurture it.
Okay, great. All right, so this one was sort of actually a follow-up to the previous question. Do you have a formula for ratios of surfaces that different levels occupy? I guess it's like how many taller plants, how many shrubs compared to how many short plants. I think that's the gist of the question.
Yeah. No, unfortunately, I don't. That again, it's going to be site specific. It's really something, and I think the best advice I can give is kind of look at nature, look at how nature does it, and try to think about that ratio. The ground, the proportion of ground that you want to cover with plant material is in some sense complete. You want that complete ground cover. That doesn't mean you have ground covers planted everywhere, because you have other things there too. So you know, I think it kind of depends on what you're trying to emulate, and I would say find something in nature that you like, and then look at those ratios.
My Monarda keeps falling prey to powdery mildew. Is there one that is more resistant?
Right. I've mentioned a couple times, I love Monarda bradburyana. I realize I don't think it's listed on the Virginia native flora, but I have seen it on the USDA website as listed to Virginia, native to Virginia. So it does not get powdery mildew, and it's a fabulous Monarda. I think you're probably referring to Monarda fistulosa, which is the wild bergamot, and that does tend to get mildew, as well as I think some of the red ones, the didma, I've seen get some powdery mildew. So you know, if you're open to it, try the bradburyana. It also has a wonderful, almost evergreenish quality to it. It stays, the leaves actually stay really pretty after the bloom is gone.
Okay, here's just a comment. I cannot say enough about blue-eyed grass instead of liriope.
That's a great, I totally agree. I love blue-eyed grass. Great suggestion.
Okay, is there a plant, is that planning tool available to lay people? That was that cool thing where you overlay plants.
Yeah, it's called iScape, ISCAPE. It does have a fee, but it's very user-friendly.
Cool. Alrighty, is buying plants and seeds from a vendor in Virginia best for success of planting in Northern Virginia rather than companies outside of our region or out of state? How much does it matter?
I would say to that it depends, and not necessarily. So it depends on the vendor you choose. And certainly the larger nurseries are not necessarily going to be sourcing their plants in Virginia. If obviously if you buy your plants from Earth Sangha, you're getting locally sourced eco-type plants. I mean, you can be 100% confident with Earth Sangha what you're getting. I'm not sure about others. And all sellers of plants, I mean, they have their own sources of supply. So unless they're growing it themselves, I'm not sure you can guarantee that. So does it matter? I think it, it depends on your tolerance for having something that's not necessarily tied to the local ecosystem.
Okay. Have you determined yet which shade-tolerant plants might do better in the presence of invasive Asian jumping worms, which I have in most of my wood-bordered garden areas?
Did you say jumping worms?
Yeah, Asian jumping worms.
I'm sorry, I haven't come across Asian jumping worms.
They're coming.
It sounds kind of scary, yeah. For a shade-loving plant that for a situation that requires some competitiveness, my go-to plant is Pachyra aurea.
All right, somebody's comment is just wanted to mention that you will need to be aware of how heavy the deer pressure is in your area. I really learned what they will not let become established in my suburban yard in Northern Virginia.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And in fact, in some areas like Leesburg, I've heard the deer are like, I mean, they're much, much worse even than I'm more close in here. Yeah, I'll just say a few words about deer. The idea of deer resistance. There is no such thing as a deer tolerant or a deer tolerant plant. I mean, there is no such thing as a plant there's nothing that a deer won't eat. Let me put it that way. It's an evolving thing. What you can do is, one thing I've done just personally, and I would usually recommend this with clients, I've eliminated all hosta and deer lily from my property, and those are deer candy. They attract deer to your property. So try to avoid the plants that attract deer. And then avoid plants that are not identified as deer resistant. There is University of Rutgers University has a wonderful website that rates plants in terms of their deer resistance, and you can go with the A list, which basically it doesn't mean deer resistant, it means deer rarely eat this plant. Rarely have been observed to eat this plant. So, try to avoid the ones that create the issues. It's definitely a problem.
We have that listed on our plant search app. It's not in the printed guide, but the app has it for each plant. And we have some local research, and then we sort of compiled research from a lot of other different sources that can give you a reasonably good idea, I think. Okay, so Maria commented that Gaillardia blooms from May to October. I have to mention that according to the Virginia Plant Atlas, it's an introduced plant.
Right.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. It would have been great.
Nice.
Great.
All right. How much do you need to improve clay soil, like in a former lawn, before planting natives?
Yeah, that's a great question. Anytime that I plant natives in sort of soil like that, I'll just call it not the top clay soil that you've unearthed from sod. You always want to add some compost at the time of planting, just to get the plants off to a good start. It's like, if you dig a hole to plant a plant, you want to throw in a handful or two of compost and just make sure you have that in there. And That's it. That's really all you should have to do. If you do soil amendment at the time of planting, you're getting it off to that good start, and then it should be fine. I personally have planted native plants in like exactly the situation you're talking about without any soil amendment, and they've done just fine. So, but I would say give them that extra boost, and they'll be that much better off.
Okay. And when you say a handful, I've heard this from other people, of compost or two. Do you mean that literally? It really doesn't take that much?
Yeah, it really doesn't. A handful or two.
Okay. You had a photo in your collage in your first slide of monarch caterpillar with milkweed bugs. Looks like you just leave those bugs.
Looks like you just what?
Leave the bugs.
Oh, I do. Yes, the aphids. Yes, I leave the aphids.
We're talking about milkweed bugs, but
Oh.
which are, I guess, native, right? But the aphids are usually non-native, and you just leave them anyway.
I don't, right. Yeah, I leave the aphids is what you're talking about. Is that the question?
The question was the milkweed bugs.
Were they
Oh, the
aphids?
milkweed bugs. Oh yeah, no, I don't touch the milkweed bugs. I let them be. They don't do any harm. The other thing is, it's my personal view, it's part of having a healthy ecosystem. I don't use pesticides. I don't, I maybe in my vegetable garden, sometimes I, will do something to avoid the non-beneficial bugs. But I'll give you an example. Cup plants. So if you grow cup plants, and this year we had a very unusual situation where the cup plants, and I think it's because we had a very moist spring, they were literally covered with red aphids by June. And I started seeing a lot of signs about, or postings about, oh, what do I do about the red aphids? What do I do about the red aphids that are covering my cup plants? They're killing them, and they're going to destroy the blooms. And people were like, hosing them down. People were using all sorts of pesticides or fertilizers to get the red aphid bugs off of their yellow cup flowers. And I did nothing. And what happened was I got a profusion of predator wasps. And of course, the cup plants are up at 8 or 9 feet, so they're not bothering me. And predator wasps are actually a beneficial pollinator. So they literally took care of all of the aphids, and the flowers did beautifully. So again, it's part of nurturing that, an ecosystem where you have good bad bugs, and the good bugs eat the bad bugs, and let nature just do its job. And usually, you can just kind of sit back and everything's fine.
Excellent, thank you. What is the best way to plant under large trees with roots poking up above the soil, maples in particular?
Oh yeah, I'm very familiar with that situation, and it's really, really hard. So I think I've had to experiment a lot with different types of ground covers and carex that will do well in that situation, and it's been touch and go. I know a lot of people love Carex pennsylvanica. I've had very little success with Carex pennsylvanica in that situation. And so I would kind of, go with, try a variety of things and see what takes off. I mean, you have open to you could use ferns, you could use ostrich fern. That tends to really be very prolific self-seeder. You could use pachyra. I've had success with pachyra, and certain types of hedges have done better than others, like Cherokee sedge does better than others and has a bigger kind of spread to it. The problem with the maple roots is that they're so prolific, and there's just isn't that nice soil for the carex or the ground cover to latch onto. So I think you need to go with something more aggressive. I'm pretty optimistic about Pachyra aurea and how that's going to work out in that situation where I've tried it.
Matt Bright suggested this year to me Carex radiata, and I planted it, and so far it looks really good. That's right under a maple tree, so.
Perfect, that's great.
He would know, I hope, I'm sure. Yeah. Right, plants specific to honeybees, not butterflies, small body bees, or long tongue bees, question mark.
I'm gonna have to pass on that one. I'm not really I haven't graduated to that level of differentiation among bees. I hope to get there someday.
Yeah, we actually, I'm just checking. I think I have a list of those on the Plant Nova Natives website of ones for, yeah. Yes. I thought I did. Maybe I don't. All right, sorry. Not looking closely though.
Future
Okay.
research.
Where can you get the pesticide-free zone shine you showed in your photo?
Yeah, there is actually a nonprofit that that sells those at a very reasonable cost, and I'm just drawing a blank on what the name is, but I think if you just even Google pesticide-free sign, it'll probably show up and you can find it. It's something like pesticide. It has the word pesticide in it. I just can't. I can't quite think of it offhand, but I'll follow up with Margaret and make sure.
Okay.
It's actually a great organization. There's a lot of really useful information there about how
Okay.
not to use pesticides.
Yeah, well, that's fine. And yeah, I was just looking again. It is on our website in the bees section. We have a list for honeybees for beekeepers.
Great.
Okay. Joanne, you said penstemons and bluebells, among others. Oh, I guess you're answering the honeybee question, probably.
Oh, good.
Correct.
Okay, thanks, Joanne. I think we're actually at the end of the questions. Any last words from anybody or questions? Okay, thank you. And there were many thank yous, right, Barbara? So yeah, terrific. Okay, that was wonderful. I'll be sending out a follow-up email with the link and a couple other things as soon as I can. So thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you again, Barbara, for a wonderful presentation.
Well, this was a lot of fun, and thank you, Margaret, and thanks to everybody who joined us.
Okay, bye everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, almost everyone's gone. So take care. Bye-bye.